In the years that followed World War II, after decades, and in some cases centuries, of colonial rule, hundreds of millions of Africans gained independence from European control. But the scourge of colonialism lived on in South Africa, where descendants of settlers and other European immigrants further subjugated 90% of the population through an overtly racist policy of segregation known as Apartheid. Non-whites couldn't vote, date, live alongside, or go to school with white people. Their movements were controlled through an internal pass system, and many of them were even stripped of their right to citizenship. In this episode, I talked to someone who grew up within that dystopian system and saw its eventual fall. Gabeba Baderoon is an associate professor of women's, gender and sexuality studies and African studies at Penn State. She's also an award-winning poet. Her very name has significance to her heritage and indeed her country's, as Gabeba explained to me.
So it's an Arabic name, but if you ask people who speak Arabic as a first language or in other parts of the world, many of them will not recognize my name. And the reason is because of the way that Arabic is spoken in South Africa, which has very much been shaped by similar aspirated sounds in Khoisan languages, in Afrikaans, etc. So I've just recently visited Morocco and people didn't recognize my name as an Arabic name. And eventually they said, Gabeba. And, they said it with a slightly different aspiration. And I said, yes, in South Africa we say Gabeba, which is a flatter aspiration sound. And it has to do with these other languages that are spoken alongside Arabic. And I love that, actually. I love the fact that my name represents the specificity of being in South Africa. And Islam actually arrived in the Cape Colony because of slavery. And so part of the remarkable reality of being Muslim in South Africa is, at least in the strand of being Muslim, that a survival through the really terribly violent period of enslavement. And so, that is also a part of my legacy that I'm very attached to and I'm very proud of. I feel very moved by the memory of that.
I read an article of yours in which you said there's a connection from apartheid that runs all the way back to the very first days of Dutch settlement in South Africa and the introduction of slavery. In what ways is that link most obviously manifested?
It's present in obvious terms. For instance, the pass laws were established during the period of slavery, which were intended to limit and regulate the movement of enslaved people and serfed people within the colonies. And these pass laws became eventually the Dom Pass law, the infamous pass law of apartheid. There's also the word coloured, for instance, is precisely that word that was used to, the term for emancipated slaves in the immediate post-emancipation period. And that word coloured then becomes reinvented and loses its connection to slavery, but becomes one of the categories of racial classification under apartheid, under the Population Registration Act. And so there are ways in which the legacy of slavery is both very clear and it's also subsumed, it's more subterranean. And the reason for that, for instance, is the ways in which violence is intricately embedded in South African history from that period, the colonial period, and the period of enslavement. So spectacular violence is used to punish recalcitrant slaves because enslaved people constituted the majority of the population of the colony, of the Cape Colony, for instance, at some point. So there was a great deal of anxiety about the meaning of slave rebellion and slave resistance. The building in of extreme violence is part of the legacy that slavery leaves for the later periods, and especially apartheid. And then one thing that I think is almost never discussed is the ways in which sexual violence, for instance, is built into the period of slavery and then very much is continued as part of what we then becomes apartheid and even post-apartheid history in South Africa. Sexual violence and sexual slavery were built into the system of slavery at the Cape. And this, unfortunately, this manifestation of extreme sexual violence is something that also is a legacy that apartheid takes up, and that even the post-apartheid period has not addressed sufficiently, because unfortunately, because of the way in which patriarchy was used as part of the mechanisms of slavery and slaveholding society and apartheid society, of course, we didn't understand that matters of gender were central to the country's history. They all seem to be secondary or on the edges. And whereas it really has, we now know, is one of the central defining features of that slaveholding period, which has lingered on, unfortunately, even into the post-apartheid period. So there are ways in which slavery is very evident, and then there are other ways in which we have to think more clearly and carefully about its legacies. And I always remember hearing a lecture by Deborah Thomas, the sociologist, the Jamaican American sociologist, who arrived in Cape Town, she says, and this was her phrase, "I recognized Cape Town the first time I saw it." And what she recognized was that Cape Town, like Jamaica, was a post-slavery society, and that it carries those legacies, those lingering marks on its physical landscape and the way in which people relate to one another, and in other less evident ways as well.